Jake Morrison checked his watch and looked across the clearing where his three teammates were setting up their equipment. The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall trees of planet Kepler 442c, and everything seemed perfect for their final training exercise. Lisa Park was adjusting her communication device while Danny Cruz cleaned his rifle and Amy Walsh organized her medical supplies. They had been on this world for 2 days now, and Jake felt confident about their mission. The 4 cadets from Terran Defense Academy were here to prove they could survive in hostile territory and complete their objectives without help from their instructors. This planet had been used for training exercises for over 10 years, and hundreds of cadets had passed through these same forests. Jake knew the dangers were minimal, but he still kept his team alert and ready for anything that might test their skills. Lisa finished with her comm unit and walked over to Jake. She was shorter than the other cadets, but her knowledge of plants and communication systems made her valuable to any team. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her brown eyes showed the focus that had made her top of their class in several subjects. She held up her device and pointed to the green light that showed everything was working properly. Danny Cruz was built like a fighter with broad shoulders and strong arms that came from years of weapons training. His blonde hair was cut short in military style, and his blue eyes never missed any detail around them. He had grown up hunting in the mountains of Colorado and could track anything that moved through the wilderness. His specialty was tactical planning, and he could find weak points in any enemy position. Amy Walsh was the team medic, and her red hair and green eyes made her easy to spot even in dense forest. She had studied biology and chemistry before joining the academy and knew more about alien life forms than most of their instructors. Her calm manner and quick thinking had saved other cadets during training accidents, and Jake trusted her completely with medical decisions. The planet around them was beautiful, with huge trees that reached toward the sky and thick undergrowth that provided cover for wildlife. The air was clean and breathable, and the gravity was almost exactly the same as Earth. Streams of clear water ran through the forest, and the temperature stayed comfortable during both day and night. It was the perfect place for military training exercises. Jake led his team deeper into the forest, where they would spend the next 3 days completing various survival challenges. They needed to find food and shelter while avoiding detection by automated sensors that their instructors had placed throughout the area. The exercise would test everything they had learned about wilderness survival and tactical movement. On their second day, the ground began to shake beneath their feet. At first, Jake thought it might be some kind of test that their instructors had planned, but the shaking grew stronger and lasted much longer than anything human technology could produce. Trees swayed back and forth, and small rocks fell from the cliffs above their campsite. Lisa checked her instruments and found that seismic activity was happening all across the continent. The readings showed that something deep underground was moving and causing the earthquakes. Amy looked worried because this kind of geological activity was not supposed to happen on this planet, according to all their briefing materials. The shaking stopped after about 10 minutes, but Jake noticed that something had changed in the forest around them. The air seemed different, and there was a strange smell that reminded him of old mushrooms and rotting wood. Danny pointed to several places where the ground had cracked open and steam was rising from the gaps. As they watched, small, glowing objects began floating up from the cracks in the earth. At first there were only a few of them, but soon the air was filled with thousands of tiny lights that drifted on the wind like glowing dust. Lisa tried to scan them with her equipment, but the readings made no sense and showed that these objects were unlike anything in their database. Amy approached one of the glowing specks with her medical scanner and immediately stepped back with alarm. She told the others that these were some kind of biological organism, but they did not match any known life form. The scanner showed that they were breaking down organic matter at the molecular level and seemed to be looking for something to consume. Danny noticed that the vegetation near the ground cracks was changing color and beginning to wilt. Leaves that had been green and healthy were turning brown and falling from the trees. Small animals that had been moving through the underbrush were now lying still, and their bodies seemed to be dissolving into the soil. Jake realized that whatever was happening was not part of their training exercise. He tried to contact their instructors using the emergency communication frequency, but received only static in response. Lisa worked on her more powerful radio equipment, but could not establish contact with anyone outside their immediate area. The glowing spores continued to spread through the forest, and everything they touched began to die. The cadets watched in horror as entire sections of the woodland collapsed into rotting heaps of organic matter. The spores seemed to move with purpose and were actively seeking out living tissue to consume. Amy discovered that their protective suits were beginning to show signs of damage where the spores had made contact. The synthetic materials were developing small holes, and the environmental seals were failing. She warned the others that they needed to find shelter immediately, or the spores would begin attacking their bodies directly. Jake made the decision to head for their planned extraction point, where a shuttle was supposed to pick them up in 2 days. As they moved through the forest, they could see that the spore infestation was spreading rapidly and consuming everything in its path. The beautiful training planet was becoming a nightmare world where nothing could survive. In the distance, they could see smoke rising from what looked like their extraction site. Danny used his binoculars and confirmed that some kind of aircraft had crashed and was burning. Their ride home was gone, and they were trapped on a world that was rapidly becoming hostile to all life. The glowing spores continued to spread across the planet like a deadly fog that consumed everything in its path. Jake led his team away from the areas where the concentration was thickest, but it seemed like there was no safe direction to travel. Everywhere they looked, the strange organisms were floating through the air and settling on plants and rocks and any surface they could find. Lisa worked constantly with her radio equipment, trying to establish contact with rescue teams or other survivors. She boosted the signal strength and tried different frequencies, but all she could hear was static, mixed with strange sounds that almost seemed like voices. The spores appeared to be interfering with electronic communications in ways that made no sense according to everything she had learned about radio technology. Amy conducted more tests on the spores, using her medical equipment, and the results became more disturbing with each scan. These organisms were not just consuming organic matter randomly, but seemed to be learning from each interaction. When she exposed a sample to heat, the spores adapted and became resistant to temperature changes. When she tried chemical treatments, they evolved defenses against those compounds within minutes. Danny observed the spores attacking their equipment and noticed patterns in their behavior that suggested intelligence. The organisms did not just land on objects by chance, but seemed to target the most important components first. They went after power sources and communication devices and weapon systems while ignoring less critical items. It was as if they could recognize technology and understood how to disable it most effectively. The team was forced to keep moving as the forest around them continued to collapse. Trees that had stood for hundreds of years crumbled into dust within hours of spore contact. The streams and rivers became contaminated with a thick substance that bubbled and moved like it was alive. Even the rocks seemed to be dissolving as the spores broke down the minerals that held them together. Jake noticed that the spores were not spreading randomly, but were following patterns that suggested coordination. Large clusters would move in specific directions while smaller groups broke off to explore side areas. It reminded him of military tactics where scouts would investigate possible threats while the main force advanced toward strategic objectives. The idea that these organisms might be working together in an organized manner was terrifying. As night fell, the spores became more active and their glow grew brighter. The forest was filled with an eerie light that made everything look like an alien nightmare. Lisa discovered that the spores were emitting some kind of signal that her equipment could detect but not decode. The signals seemed to be getting stronger and more complex, as if the organisms were communicating with each other. About what they had learned, Amy found evidence that the spores were not just destroying life, but were somehow harvesting information from the organisms they consumed. Brain tissue seemed to be a particular target, and the spores would concentrate their attack on the nervous systems of any creature they encountered. She began to suspect that these organisms were not just killing for food, but were stealing knowledge and memories from their victims. Danny tried to use his weapons against concentrations of spores, but discovered that conventional ammunition was useless. The organism simply absorbed the energy from explosions and seemed to become stronger rather than weaker. His rifle began to malfunction as spores infiltrated the firing mechanism and corroded the internal components. Even his backup weapons started failing as the organisms found ways to disable them. The cadets reached what had once been a training facility that was supposed to provide emergency shelter for exercises like theirs. The building was still standing, but the walls were covered with a thick layer of spores that pulsed with inner light. Jake could see through the windows that the interior was filled with the same glowing fog that had consumed the forest. Lisa detected massive electronic activity coming from inside the facility. The spores had somehow taken control of the building's computer systems and were using them for purposes that she could not understand. Data was flowing through the networks at incredible speeds, and the power consumption had increased far beyond normal levels. Whatever the spores were doing required enormous amounts of processing power. Amy scanned the building and found that the spores inside had formed into larger structures that resembled some kind of alien technology. These formations were actively generating energy and seemed to be coordinating the activities of spores across wide areas of the planet. The organisms had transformed a human facility into something completely foreign and hostile. Danny suggested that they try to reach the emergency bunkers that were located deeper underground. These shelters were designed to protect people from radiation and chemical attacks and might provide temporary safety from the spore infestation. The bunkers had independent life support systems and communication equipment that might still be functional. As they moved toward the bunker locations, Jake realized that the spores were beginning to follow them more aggressively. Groups of organisms would detach from the main clusters and pursue the team like hunting animals tracking prey. The cadets had to change directions frequently and use cover to avoid being surrounded by the deadly creatures. The spores seemed to be learning from their escape attempts and were getting better at predicting where the humans would go next. Lisa noticed that the organisms were positioning themselves to cut off potential routes, while other groups moved to force the team toward areas where spore concentration was highest. It was like being hunted by an enemy that could think and plan and adapt its strategy based on their actions. Amy discovered that prolonged exposure to even small amounts of spores was causing cellular damage that their medical equipment could barely detect. The organisms were somehow bypassing their protective suits and beginning to affect their bodies at the molecular level. She estimated that they had perhaps 2 or 3 days before the damage became permanent and irreversible. The first emergency bunker they reached had been completely overrun by spores that had somehow penetrated the supposedly secure facility. The organisms had not only gotten inside but had taken control of the bunker systems and were using them to coordinate attacks across the planet. Jake realized that nowhere on this world would be safe from creatures that could adapt to any defense and learn from every encounter. Jake decided that they needed to follow standard military survival protocols if they were going to survive until rescue arrived. He gathered his team and reviewed everything they had been taught about emergency situations and hostile environments. Their training manuals contained detailed procedures for dealing with biological threats and contaminated zones, and Jake was determined to implement every recommendation. Lisa began constructing an emergency communication array using parts from their damaged equipment and components salvaged from the crashed shuttle. She followed the technical specifications exactly and built multiple redundant systems to ensure that at least one would be able to send a distress signal to any rescue ships that might be looking for them. The work was difficult because the spores kept attacking her tools and dissolving the metal connections. Danny established a defensive perimeter around their temporary camp using motion sensors and automated weapons platforms that he assembled from their military supplies. He positioned the equipment according to standard tactical doctrine and created overlapping fields of fire that should stop any ground assault. The defensive systems were designed to handle human attackers and alien wildlife, but he hoped they would also work against the Spore creatures. Amy set up a medical station with air filtration equipment and decontamination chambers that were supposed to protect them from biological weapons and toxic environments. She prepared chemical treatments and antibiotics that should counteract most known pathogens and created isolation protocols to prevent cross-contamination between team members. Her medical computer contained data on thousands of alien organisms and their weaknesses. The standard protocols failed almost immediately as the spores proved capable of overcoming every defensive measure. Lisa watched in horror as her communication array was consumed by the organisms faster than she could replace the damaged components. The spores seemed to understand electronics better than she did, and they attacked the most critical connections first to cause maximum system failure. Danny's defensive weapons became useless as the spores infiltrated their targeting computers and firing mechanisms. The automated guns began shooting randomly or stopped working entirely as the organisms corrupted their control software. Even worse, the spores learned from each weapon they disabled and became better at attacking similar systems. His motion sensors gave false readings as the creatures learned to avoid detection. Amy discovered that her medical equipment was actively being sabotaged by spores that had somehow gotten inside supposedly sealed containers. Her air filtration systems became clogged with organisms that then used the ventilation to spread throughout her medical station. The antibiotics and chemical treatments that should have killed biological threats had no effect on the spores and seemed to make them stronger. The team's emergency shelter dissolved around them as the spores found ways to break down even the most resistant synthetic materials. The polymer walls that were designed to withstand radiation and chemical attack crumbled like paper when exposed to the alien organisms. Their sleeping bags and protective clothing began developing holes that grew larger every hour. Jake tried to contact rescue teams using the emergency beacon that was supposed to broadcast their location to any search vessels in the system. The beacon had its own power supply and was built to function even under extreme conditions, but the spores had learned to jam electronic signals. Instead of sending out a distress call, the device began transmitting random noise that would confuse. Rather than help any potential rescuers, Lisa attempted to repair their communication equipment, but found that the spores were attacking her tools faster than she could use them. Screwdrivers and electronic components would begin dissolving the moment she took them out of storage. Even her instruction manuals were being consumed by organisms that seemed to recognize technical information and targeted specifically for destruction. Danny's weapons training became worthless as his ammunition supplies dwindled and his firearms began malfunctioning. The spores had learned to attack gunpowder and explosive compounds, making his grenades and rockets useless. His combat knife was the only weapon that still functioned, but it was no match for swarms of organisms that could attack from all directions simultaneously. Amy's medical knowledge seemed inadequate to deal with an enemy that could adapt to any treatment within minutes. The spores were unlike any biological organism in her database, and they violated every rule of biochemistry and evolution that she had studied. They seemed to exist in a state between living creature and advanced technology that made them impossible to classify or understand. The training facility they had hoped to use as a base of operations became a death trap when the spores took control of its automated systems. Security doors locked them inside while ventilation fans spread concentrated spores throughout the building. The facility's computer began displaying messages in languages that no human had ever seen, while machinery activated and deactivated in patterns that served no apparent purpose. Jake realized that everything they had been taught at the academy was useless against an enemy that could learn and adapt faster than humans could respond. Standard military tactics assumed that opponents would follow predictable patterns and have consistent weaknesses, but the spores changed their behavior constantly and seemed to anticipate every strategy the cadets tried to implement. The emergency Rations that were supposed to sustain them for weeks became inedible as spores contaminated their food supplies. Water purification tablets had no effect on streams that were filled with alien organisms and their water recycling. Equipment became clogged with creatures that seemed to multiply inside the filtration system. Even their backup power cells began failing as spores learned to drain electrical energy. Lisa's botanical knowledge became more of a curse than a blessing as she realized that the spores were violating every law of plant biology. They reproduced without seeds or spores of their own and grew in environments that should have been lethal to any Earth organism. They seemed to draw energy from sources that she could not identify, and they communicated through methods that her instruments could not detect. Danny found that his tactical training was worse than useless because the spores could observe his strategies and develop countermeasures faster than he could implement new plans. Every position he chose was compromised within hours, and every escape route was blocked before he could use it. The organism seemed to be several steps ahead of him in every tactical decision. Amy watched her medical supplies dwindle as the spores consumed everything she needed to treat injuries and illness. Her diagnostic equipment gave readings that made no sense, and her treatment protocols had no effect on the alien contamination. She began to suspect that the spores were not just attacking their bodies but were somehow infiltrating their thoughts and memories. By the end of their 4th day on the planet, Jake had to accept that conventional military training was not going to save them from an enemy that treated human technology as food and human tactics as puzzles to be solved. They needed to find a completely different approach if they were going to survive long enough for rescue to arrive. Jake stared at the remains of their high-tech equipment scattered around their camp and made a decision that went against everything he had learned in military training. He told his team to abandon all their electronic devices and synthetic materials and start thinking like humans did thousands of years ago before they had advanced technology. If modern equipment was just feeding the spores, then they needed to go back to the most basic survival methods. Lisa was reluctant to give up her communication gear, but she could see that the spores were learning from every piece of technology they encountered. She began looking at the natural materials around them and remembered stories her grandmother had told about how Native Americans used smoke signals to communicate over long distances. She started gathering different types of wood and leaves to experiment with making signals that other humans could see, but spores might ignore. Danny felt lost without his weapons and tactical equipment, but Jake reminded him that humans had been hunters and warriors long before they invented guns and explosives. Danny began searching for rocks and branches that he could shape into primitive tools and weapons. He remembered camping trips with his father where they had made fire by rubbing sticks together, and he wondered if basic fire might affect the spores differently than electronic flamethrowers. Amy was afraid to lose her medical equipment, but she realized that her computerized diagnostics were useless against an enemy that could corrupt any electronic system. She started thinking about the medicinal plants that grew wild in these forests and the traditional remedies that humans had used for centuries before modern pharmaceuticals. Her biology training included information about natural compounds that might have properties her synthetic drugs lacked. The team began experimenting with materials that the spores seemed to ignore completely. Jake noticed that simple grass and mud were not being consumed by the organisms, while synthetic polymers dissolved almost instantly. He wondered if the spores had evolved to attack complex manufactured materials, but could not process the simple organic compounds that made up natural vegetation. Lisa discovered that smoke from certain types of wood seemed to confuse the spores and make them less aggressive. When she burned pine branches mixed with oak leaves, the organisms would retreat from the smoke and seemed unable to coordinate their normal attack patterns. She began mapping which combinations of natural materials produced the most effective results and developing a system of signals that could convey complex information. Danny found that sharpened stones and wooden spears could actually damage individual spores in ways that his advanced weapons could not. The organism seemed unable to adapt to physical attacks that used no technology at all. A simple rock thrown with accuracy could scatter a cluster of spores, while his explosive grenades had only made them stronger. He began teaching himself to hunt and fight like his ancestors had done. Amy experimented with plant extracts and found that certain combinations could slow down spore penetration of human tissue. When she applied a paste made from crushed berries and tree bark to areas where spores had made contact, the cellular damage stopped progressing and even began to reverse. The natural compounds seemed to work through mechanisms that the spores could not understand or counter. Jake realized that their biggest advantage was not their technology, but their ability to think creatively and adapt to new situations. The spores might be intelligent, but they seemed to operate according to fixed patterns that they had learned from consuming other civilizations. Humans could change their behavior in ways that might be completely unpredictable to organisms that expected technological responses to every threat. The team started building shelter using techniques that were thousands of years old and materials that came directly from the forest around them. They wove grass into tight mats and used mud mixed with plant fibers to create walls that the spores completely ignored. Their primitive shelters were more effective than their high-tech emergency equipment had been and required no power source that the organisms could drain. Lisa developed a communication system using reflected sunlight and smoke patterns that could send messages across great distances without using any electronic components. She created a simple code based on the number and timing of signals that any human could learn quickly, but that seemed to be invisible to the spores. For the first time since the disaster began, she felt confident that they could contact rescue teams if any arrived. Danny began creating weapons and tools that worked through simple physics rather than complex chemistry or electronics. His wooden spears and stone knives were crude compared to his military equipment, but they were completely immune to spore interference. He learned to start fires using friction methods that produced heat the organisms could not absorb or redirect. Amy found that traditional healing methods were more effective against spore contamination than any of her advanced medical treatments. When she treated wounds with honey and certain plant oils, the healing was faster and more complete than anything her synthetic drugs had achieved. The natural compounds seemed to work in harmony with human biology in ways that confused and defeated the alien organisms. The cadets discovered that working together, using primitive methods, they could accomplish things that had been impossible with their individual high-tech specialties. When Lisa used smoke signals to coordinate with Danny's hunting and Amy's gathering, while Jake planned their movements using natural landmarks, they operated as an effective team that the spores could not predict or counter. They began developing increasingly sophisticated techniques that used only natural materials and human creativity. Jake taught them to camouflage themselves using mud and plant matter that made them nearly invisible to spore detection. Lisa created a network of signal stations that could relay messages across the continent. Danny learned to trap and hunt the few animals that had survived spore contact, and Amy found ways to purify water and preserve food using methods that required no artificial processing. For the first time since the spores had emerged, the team successfully avoided detection for an entire day and night. They moved through the forest using paths that only humans would recognize and communicated through signals that required human intelligence to decode. Their primitive camp was completely hidden from the organisms that continued to search for them using technological methods. Jake began to understand that human ingenuity was not about building better machines, but about solving problems in ways that no other species would think to try. Humans could adapt and improvise and create solutions from whatever materials were available. The spores had learned to defeat advanced civilizations, but they had no experience with opponents who would abandon technology completely and return to the most basic survival methods. The team realized that they had found the key to surviving against an enemy that seemed invincible. By thinking like primitive humans and using only natural materials and simple tools, they had become invisible to organisms that were adapted to fight technological opponents. Their creativity and adaptability were weapons that no alien intelligence could understand or counter because they were uniquely human traits that could not be learned or duplicated. On the 6th day after the spore outbreak, Jake noticed changes in the sky that suggested rescue ships might be approaching the planet. Lisa confirmed his observations by watching the patterns of light that reflected off the upper atmosphere and using her knowledge of spacecraft propulsion to identify the signatures of human vessels. She immediately began preparing smoke signals that would warn the incoming ships about the dangers they would face. Commander Helen Grant led the rescue mission aboard the starship Meridian, and she was puzzled by the complete communications blackout from the planet's surface. All electronic signals from Kepler 442c had stopped 3 days earlier, and satellite imagery showed massive ecological collapse across the training areas. Her ship's sensors detected unusual energy patterns that suggested some kind of alien activity, but the readings made no sense according to any known science. Dr. Kevin Stone was the mission's xenobiologist, and he studied the atmospheric samples that their probes had collected from the planet. The data showed the presence of unknown organisms that seemed to exist in a state between living creatures and nanotechnology. These entities appeared to be actively hostile to electronic equipment and had somehow taken control of the planet's entire technological infrastructure. Captain Sam Rodriguez prepared his shuttle for the rescue mission, but he was troubled by reports that similar spacecraft had crashed when they attempted to land on the contaminated surface. The spores seemed to be able to interfere with navigation systems and engine controls in ways that made conventional aircraft nearly impossible to fly safely. He would need to find an alternative approach that did not rely on sophisticated technology. Jake saw the shuttle approaching from the east and immediately lit the signal fires that Lisa had prepared at strategic locations around their hidden camp. The smoke rose in carefully timed patterns that spelled out warnings about electronic equipment failure and provided coordinates using a simple numeric code that any human pilot could decode. He hoped that the rescue team would understand the primitive communication method and recognize the intelligence behind it. Lisa used polished metal fragments to reflect sunlight toward the incoming aircraft in sequences that provided additional information about safe landing areas and spore concentration patterns. Her signals were based on ancient maritime communication techniques that required no power source and could not be interfered with by the alien organisms. She had tested the system extensively and was confident that human observers would recognize it as an intentional message. Commander Grant was surprised to receive reports from her sensor operators about smoke signals and light flashes coming from the planet's surface. The patterns were clearly artificial and seemed to be conveying specific information about dangers and landing sites. She realized that the survivors had abandoned electronic communication entirely and were using methods that were thousands of years old but completely immune to spore interference. Dr. Stone analyzed the primitive signals and concluded that they indicated a level of intelligence and adaptation that was remarkable under the circumstances. The survivors had not only figured out how to avoid the spores but had developed sophisticated communication techniques using only natural materials. Their signals showed detailed knowledge of spore behavior patterns and provided tactical information that would be essential for a successful rescue operation. Captain Rodriguez studied the landing zone coordinates that the survivors had provided and noticed that they had chosen an area with specific atmospheric conditions that would minimize spore activity. The location was far from any technological installations and was surrounded by natural barriers that would provide protection during the extraction process. He began planning an approach that would use minimal electronics and rely primarily on visual navigation. Amy had been monitoring atmospheric conditions using techniques she had learned from studying traditional weather prediction methods, and she calculated that there would be a brief window when wind patterns would disperse the spore concentrations, enough to allow safe landing. She used smoke signals to inform Lisa about the optimal timing, and Lisa relayed the information to the approaching rescue team using their established code system. Danny prepared the landing site by creating barriers from natural materials and positioning controlled fires at locations that would create a spore-free zone large enough for the shuttle to land safely. His defensive preparations used no technology that the organisms could detect or interfere with, but they would provide effective protection against spore infiltration during the critical extraction phase. The rescue team made the unprecedented decision to attempt the mission using minimal electronic equipment and relying primarily on human skill and primitive navigation techniques. Captain Rodriguez disabled most of his shuttle's automated systems and prepared to fly manually using only basic instruments that the spores might not be able to affect. Commander Grant authorized the risky approach because conventional rescue methods had already failed multiple times. Jake guided the incoming shuttle to their prepared landing zone using a combination of smoke signals and reflected light that provided real-time navigation information without using any electronic communication. The primitive guidance system worked perfectly and allowed the pilot to avoid areas where Spore concentration was dangerous while approaching the safe extraction point that the cadets had identified. The shuttle landed successfully in the protected zone that Danny had created, and the rescue team was amazed to discover that the cadets had survived by completely abandoning their military training and returning to Stone Age survival methods. Captain Rodriguez and his crew had to discard their own advanced equipment and rely on simple protective clothing made from natural fibers in order to operate safely in the spore-contaminated environment. Amy treated the rescue team for minor spore exposure using traditional remedies that she had developed during their isolation, and the healing was faster and more effective than anything their modern medical equipment could have achieved. The natural compounds she had discovered seemed to work in ways that the spores could not understand or counteract. Lisa coordinated the extraction by establishing a communication network between the landing site and safe zones throughout the area using only smoke signals and reflected light. Her primitive but sophisticated system allowed the entire rescue operation to proceed without any electronic equipment that the spores could attack or compromise. The combined rescue team and survivors made their way to the shuttle using camouflage techniques and movement patterns that made them nearly invisible to spore detection. They followed paths that Jake had marked using arrangements of stones and bent branches that would be meaningless to alien organisms but provided clear guidance to human observers. Commander Grant watched the successful extraction with amazement and realized that the cadets had discovered something profound about human survival capabilities. When their technology failed them, they had not given up, but had instead found ways to succeed using the most basic human abilities of creativity and adaptation. Their primitive solutions had defeated an alien threat that had overwhelmed advanced civilizations. Dr. Stone documented everything the survivors had learned about fighting the spores using natural methods and traditional techniques that required no technology at all. Their discoveries would revolutionize military training and provide humanity with new strategies for dealing with threats that could neutralize advanced equipment. The cadets had proven that human ingenuity was more powerful than any machine. As the shuttle left the contaminated planet behind, Jake looked back at the world where they had nearly died and realized that the experience had taught him something important about what it meant to be human. Technology was useful, but creativity and adaptability were the real strengths that allowed humans to survive and thrive in a dangerous universe. No alien intelligence could duplicate or defeat the human ability to find new solutions to impossible problems.